As someone who recently got a year older, I feel like I'm better suited than most to tell you that everything dies eventually. I'm on the upper end of an age group now that tends to give you a bit more perspective on life, and it's obvious to me that I should be channeling this new Zen-like knowledge into video games and how sometimes people stop making the video games that we love. I mean, we've got giant libraries to choose from and hundreds of new releases every year, but it's not what I really want. And only now am I realizing how depressing this video might be. So a video game franchise being dead usually applies to the idea that most of the big IPs have relatively frequent releases to capitalize on active fan bases that will line up for miles on release day. This is the cycle that popular franchises go through on a regular basis, which only makes it more apparent when others haven't had a new game in many, many years, and lay dormant at best or very dead at worst. Specifically, I want to talk about game franchises that haven't had a new game in a while, but are perfectly set up to be one of these IPs that churn new stuff out fairly regularly. Maybe it's a classic franchise that lost momentum, or a new series that didn't capitalize on some early promise, but all I know is that this unfulfilled potential makes me sad, and I need to share it with the internet. This is my coping mechanism, deal with it. But look on the bright side, every time I make a video like this that makes big sweeping conclusions and laments the way that things are at the very moment of recording this video, things tend to transpire in a way that makes me look incorrect. And hey, if I say that one of these franchises is dead and we get a new game, oh well, never been happier to be incredibly wrong. Whichever way you shake it, this has been a pretty incredible console generation for PlayStation. Their competitors have helped them out a lot, with Nintendo taking a while to find a decent console to work with, and Microsoft obsessing over numbers rather than quality exclusives, but Sony have switched gears with the PS4, and now it's home to a ton of exciting games and iconic characters, which hasn't always been the case. I mean, Nintendo has said Mario since forever, and Microsoft has been relying on Master Chief for years, so it's nice to see that Sony are at a stage now where their exclusives are picking up some of the slack. Mind you, rewind back to the turn of the century and something very similar was happening, in part down to Jak and Daxter. It was this fun little platformer made by an underrated studio called something like, Bad Dog or something. Not sure what they've done since then, but I'm sure it was important. Hey, it must have been, since we haven't had a new mainline Jak and Daxter game for 15 years, and a new game of any sort for 10. I don't need to tell you that we're very overdue. So this is the primary difference between a video that talks about how sad it is that some franchises have been abandoned, and a video talking about what sequels I want to be made, because one of those videos is a hell of a lot more optimistic, and I'm making the less optimistic one right now. I'm saying that Jak and Daxter could use some more sequels, but do I honestly think they are going to get some? I wouldn't bet on it. Actually, the easiest distinction would be that something like Pokemon Snap would make for a cool sequel, since we have a few more Pokemon to take pictures of now, but you would have a hard time convincing anyone that Pokemon Snap is a dead franchise. A sequel would be nice, but it doesn't deserve one, if you know what I mean by that. Jak and Daxter was the project that Naughty Dog switched to in order to create a less linear style of platforming while still maintaining the same kind of cartoony charm found in Crash Bandicoot. This is some time before they introduced shooting and driving and angry voice acting Jak, and even longer before Naughty Dog moved on to newer projects like the Uncharted games and The Last of Us. I think you can attribute the lack of Jak and Daxter games down to the emergence of those new Naughty Dog IPs, which is hardly a bad thing, but potentially concerning if they continue to become the focus of Naughty Dog's attention. There were plans for a new Jak and Daxter game before development started on The Last of Us, but with the amount of work that goes into these games, it makes perfect sense that something like Jak and Daxter would be shelved for the future. It's a bit awkward because Naughty Dog stopped making these games because they were too busy, and you'd have to wonder if there would ever be a time when they'd go back to it. Are they too Hollywood for their fun little action game? Hopefully not. Looking back at the last decade, there's actually a lot that's been left behind from the new wave of next-gen video games. This always happens, either because of just the sheer quantity of games vying to be the next quintessential next-gen experience, or they're just not all that great. Alternatively, you have something like Dead Space, which gathered a lot of pace towards the back end of the 2000s and terrified audiences worldwide with a trilogy of horror action games that gradually got more actiony and steadily worse with time. It was such an institution though that, yes, peaked with the original Dead Space in 2008, but was such a large part of gaming culture around that time that it's surprising we only got 3 games out of what was quite clearly a successful and relatively unique formula. It always got so much publicity for how violent it was, with an entire marketing campaign for the second one based around your mum really not liking this game. This level of edgy marketing makes me nostalgic for a simpler time. The biggest problem with Dead Space is that its main developers, HalfLife Games, were under the guiding hand of everyone's favourite out-of-touch idiots, EA, who have a lengthy history of deciding on an idea and pursuing it even when it's a fucking stupid idea. In 2017, someone decided that single-player campaigns weren't cool anymore and that everyone at EA would be much better suited to focusing on multiplayer titles filled with loot boxes. Which is a sentiment that was echoed and agreed with the world over, obviously. Since Dead Space isn't exactly built for multiplayer, the decision was taken to close down HalfLife and all of their projects, laying off a ton of staff and cancelling their upcoming Star Wars game, and also Dead Space 4. I'm not sure if this is something that EA would ever want to pursue in the future, but with so few of the key staff left over from their time working on Dead Space, I'm not sure it would be much more than a cynical cash-in on a popular name, something that EA has absolutely no history of doing before. Wow, what a foreign concept for EA. We've seen large publishers take over creative control after removing the developer before, and it has not ended well for anyone. You can't spell Grim Reaper without EA. Originally, I didn't plan on talking about franchises that were surprisingly dead, but I think it makes for a hell of a lot more interesting set of case studies about why exactly franchises went under. If just because it acts as a cautionary tale that potentially any big franchise can stop producing games for whatever reason, even some of the most important ones ever made. So I'm about to talk about Half-Life and how few games we got out of this very exciting concept, but I have to remind everyone, and indeed myself, that the eventual collapse of this franchise would have been a pretty massive shock to the system considering what Half-Life did for the gaming industry and Valve. Obviously in the year 2019 AD, everyone is super accepting of the fact that Valve's priorities lie elsewhere and that we'll never get a new Half-Life game, but I for one find it a little incredible that we got to this stage in the first place. The original Half-Life was a fairly important building block for the first-person shooter genre and introduced the world to Gordon Freeman and his alien-stomping ways, but the impact that Half-Life 2 had is somewhat akin to a very large meteor striking the surface of the Earth. Maybe that's why there's no Half-Life 3. Half-Life 2 killed anyone who could have possibly made it. But still, with the success and influence that Half-Life 2 brought with it, you'd imagine it'd only be a matter of time before Valve completed the trilogy and closed off the agonizing cliffhanger at the end of Half-Life 2 Episode 2. For whatever reason, founder Gabe Newell stopped mentioning anything to do with Half-Life around 2010, as Valve's focus began to shift towards multiplayer games. Sounds all too familiar, doesn't it? Insider sources have claimed that concepts for a new Half-Life game of some description came and went with no real effort being put towards making them a reality, but the harsh reality is that the second episode of Half-Life 2 came out in 2007, and we've heard of virtually nothing concrete since then. In fact, Half-Life is so deep underground at this point that former Valve writer Mark Laidlaw leaked the proposed plot to a new game in 2017 which felt like the final nail in the coffin to any vague hopes of seeing more Half-Life at any point. These days, Valve are up to their eyeballs in money from Steam sales. There's not exactly a need to push through with a game that likely would never be good enough to warrant waiting this long. Can't even describe it as development hell. That would imply there was ever a game being made here. Of all the many different game developers out there, Nintendo seems like one of the few to try a bit harder in order to not let a franchise die. I'm not sure if that's got anything to do with how crazy popular Smash Bros is these days and how Nintendo have frequently used it as a means of revitalizing franchises, but there aren't too many properties of theirs that are currently laying dormant. The problem is that the IPs of theirs that could be considered dead still have a ton of untapped potential that Nintendo could still find some use for, and maybe you're in the camp where you might think that the likes of Chibi Robo or Advanced Wars or even something huge like Mother has had its day, but no one needs reminding that we haven't had a new F-Zero game of any sort for 15 years and 3 console generations. I've learned things at school and forgotten about them to pursue a career on YouTube in that time. The world's changed a lot in 15 years. The most damning fact is that the mascot of the F-Zero series, some cool guy called Captain Falcon, has been in 3 lots of Smash Bros games since his last outing in an F-Zero game, which probably means he's better known for his fighting skills than his racing ones. So, if you're thinking that F-Zero has been consigned to the history books, you're not far wrong. Which is a crazy thing to think about, because F-Zero GX came out in 2003 and most people really enjoyed what a fun and also bullshit hard game it was. It came out a few months before Mario Kart Double Dash, and I think where these two franchises diverge from here is indicative of where Nintendo decided to put their focus. Mario Kart became one of their most bankable titles with an absolute ton of people keen to throw shells at their loved ones, whereas F-Zero kinda stopped here. These games have always been a bit more challenging than your average racers, which may have perturbed Nintendo enough to leave this series alone for a while, but Shigeru Miyamoto has gone on record for saying that he was surprised that people still wanted F-Zero all these years later, and that he thought that everyone had grown tired of it. Which is something that has been said about every time I remind people to subscribe if they're enjoying the video, and click the bell to do a thing, even though YouTube is run by a merciless set of numbers that doesn't like me very much. Look for any advantage you can get, guys. I can see concerns about F-Zero working in the right amount of innovation and bringing it into the modern day without losing too much of its identity, but I don't think there should be any worries about the game's difficulty. These games, we throw ourselves at hard games again and again until something sticks, so a futuristic racing game with a sharp difficulty curve that occupies a space within Nintendo's market that is currently unused? That would be an amazing idea. Plus, I think Captain Falcon deserves a bit more love. You got kids playing Smash Bros thinking that he's an original character. Get the Falcon Punch in there somewhere, I know you want to. It appears we've come to the portion of the video where I have to talk about Konami and all their shenanigans, because you simply can't talk about dead franchises without bringing up the self-destructive habits of formerly one of the biggest names in the industry. You look down a list of franchises with their name attached to it, and there's so much history here, with some of the finest games ever made leaping out at you with the Konami logo emblazoned on them. Makes you feel nostalgic for a time when Bomberman was fully in its stride, or when Silent Hill was scary, or when Metal Gear was actually a video game. We are a long way removed from all of that now. And I don't think this is represented better than the equally slow and surprisingly abrupt decline of Castlevania. If you think that all the crap surrounding Konami came to light around about 2015, that explains why most of Konami's big franchises downside production going forward after this date. The same can't be said of Castlevania though, since this franchise was already on the wane a number of years before this. At a glance, you might look at the release date of the second Lords of Shadow game and think that 5 years isn't really long enough of a gap to definitively say that Castlevania is a dead franchise, but this was supposed to be a reboot. A reboot that got its disappointing sequel, and that was that, basically. Can't be that simple though, surely. The departure of Koji Igarashi, or Iga, in 2014 wouldn't have helped much, since you can attribute a lot of the genius of classic Castlevania to him and his team, but I still find it very surprising that Konami haven't even tried to squeeze out games with the Castlevania likeness attached to them, like they've done with Metal Gear post Hideo Kojima's involvement. Mind you, there has been pachinko and Japanese-only mobile games, not to mention a Netflix series, and of course some pretty big representation in Smash Bros. Ultimate, so it's obvious that Castlevania still has some resonance in pop culture. We just need Konami to recognize that. For now, we've got Iga's Kickstarter game Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which is everything that Mighty No. 9 tried and failed to be, and a wonderful thing that everyone should be playing. I don't even know what Castlevania should be in 2019, maybe a 2D platformer like Symphony of the Night and Super Castlevania, or maybe a 3D action game with grapple mechanics like Sekiro. Both of those make me hopeful for a future that may never come. This is RabbidLuigi, and the problem isn't so much with Castlevania as it is with Konami in general, because the latter just aren't making many games anymore. Apart from some anniversary collections and some Pro Evo and Contra, they mostly seem to be focusing on pachinko more so than video games. And hey, gaming is all about that reckless gambling these days, so they're just cutting out the middleman. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.